Hey there, I'm Oliver Schnusenberg, and today I will be presenting the neuroscience of financial behavior, connecting hidden patterns for more effective therapy. I'm really glad you're here. Roxy's glad you're here too. Roxy's sleeping. I came at this work from a few different angles. So I've got a background in finance, but also psychology and neuroscience and life coaching. And over the years, I've worked with thousands of students and clients, always trying to help people make more intentional, less stressful choices. In this presentation, you'll hear me talk a lot about the brain, how it influences behaviors like procrastination, perfectionism, and avoidance, especially when emotions and money are involved. I pull from neuroscience, but also from coaching and therapeutic modalities like ACT and IFS, though I keep it grounded in a coaching space, not clinical therapy. And I always keep values at the center because when we understand what really matters to us and how our brain might be getting in the way, we can start to build habits and decisions that feel aligned and sustainable. So, whether you're a coach, therapist, planner, or just someone curious about why we do what we do, I hope you find something here that clicks. Thank you for being here. Okay, so the neuroscience of financial behavior, connecting hidden patterns for more effective therapy. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through three different pairs of behaviors: procrastination and financial trauma, perfectionism and financial anxiety, and loss aversion and grief. And for each of those, I'm going to explain the role of key brain regions, offer some practical implications, and also a therapeutic reframe on how you can approach this with clients. So, the ultimate goal here is to have you view things through a different lens when talking with your clients and to think about the interplay between different manifestations or conditions or behaviors. So let's start with procrastination and trauma. So historically, procrastination was associated with passive aggressive personality disorder, which included procrastination as a core feature. So that diagnosis was removed from the DSM-5 and is no longer officially recognized. So let's go with this definition from Steele. Procrastination is a prevalent and pernicious form of self regulatory failure involving the voluntary delay of an intended course of action despite expecting to be worse off for the delay. So, in other words, you're putting off something that you should be doing and you're not going to do it, even though you're going to feel worse for not doing it. That's kind of what that means, right? Uh, so, let's go with trauma. So, I focus here on the DSM-5 definition of PTSD, which is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So, directly experiencing the event, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend, or experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. Uh, so notice that trauma in the DSM-5 is not just any stressful event. It must involve threats to life, physical integrity, or sexual safety, and the exposure must be direct, witnessed, or vicarious in a professional context. So also note that the DSM does not really differentiate between, other trauma that we are aware of, like developmental trauma or complex trauma, and then the discussion currently between big T and little t trauma, which has received some attention. So little t trauma not really shouldn't be belittled, because it is just as important as big T trauma. But that's beyond the scope of this presentation itself. So let's get started then on procrastination and trauma and what is involved. So I'm going to focus on three brain regions here. And by the way, the brain regions that I focus on, very important, are not the only ones involved here. So I picked and chose those that I think provide the most background to what we're talking about and are the most important. So let's start with the hippocampus. You can think of the hippocampus as your mental librarian and time traveler. So it not only files your memories, but it also helps you revisit the past and simulate the future, which grounds you in both space and time. So the hippocampus is important for various functions: episodic memory formation, memory consolidation, spatial navigation and context, episodic future thinking, like I just mentioned, and but also stress regulation. So second is the amygdala. So you can think of the amygdala as your brain's emotional smoke detector. It's quick to alert you of potential threats, but sometimes overreacts to a burnt piece of toast, right? So it's small, almond shaped. You can see it right here. It's a structure located deep within the temporal lobes. So its main functions are fear detections and threat response, emotional memory, emotional processing, modulation of decision making, and regulation of arousal and vigilance. And then we have the prefrontal cortex. And here specifically, I want to focus on the medial prefrontal cortex. That's like your inner storyteller and compass. So it helps you make sense of your experiences, right? Of who you are, what you've been through, and how it all fits together. So the compass kind of keeps you oriented towards your values and guides decisions that align with your identity, your emotions, and your social understanding. So the core functions of the medial prefrontal cortex are self-referential thinking, social understanding and empathy, emotional regulation and stress response, and decision making guided by values. All right. So what of these three different systems? So how do we practically relate this to what we're talking about? So the timekeeper, the hippocampus, in procrastination, the timekeeper can't imagine a meaningful future. It struggles to create a vivid mental picture of reward and makes the task feel pointless. But in PTSD, the timekeeper is stuck in the past. It replays the trauma as if it's happening now and fails to recognize when you're safe. So together, in both cases, you kind of lose your sense of when you are, right? You're trapped in fear of the past or avoidance of the future. The amygdala, so the alarm bell, the smoke detector, in procrastination, the alarm bell rings at every challenge. It magnifies that discomfort, right? Like it'll basically says to you, it'll be awful, avoid it. And in PTSD, the alarm bell never turns off. It sees danger everywhere, even in safe contexts. So together, what that means is you live in a heightened emotional state. You're constantly wired for defense and you're wired against action. The control panel, so the medial prefrontal cortex, in procrastination, it undervalues the long term benefit and overestimates effort. But in PTSD, the control panel can't suppress emotional surges. It's offline when you need to regulate or think clearly. So, together, basically, you lose control over your responses and you're pushed around by emotion rather than guided by intention. So, procrastination and PTSD both hijack your internal systems, right? So, you aren't lazy or broken, right? Your brain is simply trying to protect you. But that protection, unfortunately, becomes a prison, right? You can't move forward because the future is fuzzy or frightening, and you can't relax because the past is loud and vivid. So, you basically cannot act because every step feels like a threat. So, as a shared mental architecture, the timekeeper is basically stuck or silent. The alarm bell is too loud. The control panel is offline. So the brain avoids action, mistrusts safety, and relives the threat. And the future feels out of reach. The past feels too close, and the present feels unsafe. So both procrastination and PTSD involve dysregulated time perception. That means the difficulty anchoring in the future or differentiating the past from the present. They also involve avoidance that is driven by internal emotional experience, whether it's aversive task aversion, anticipation, pardon me, or trauma recall. And they also involve over reliance on emotion based systems like the amygdala in the absence of strong hippocampal contextualization. So, whether it's putting off a tax return or reliving a traumatic event, the hippocampus plays a key role in how we relate to time. When that system fails, people get stuck either in what's painful in the past or what's overwhelming about the future. So, helping clients re engage with values and safe, goal oriented imagery can retrain that system. So, how can we use therapeutic modalities here to help our clients? Well, the timekeeper wants to help you imagine what's possible. So we could use values based visualization here and maybe future self journaling to retrain. The alarm bell wants to keep you safe. So we could use mindfulness or somatic grounding and maybe exposure therapy. And the control panel wants to guide you wisely. So you can bring it back online by using decision mapping or acceptance and commitment therapy diffusion. So, for example, in decision mapping, so the core elements of a decision map would be the decision point, like what is the choice you're facing, then the options, what are all the realistic paths forward, and then the outcomes, what could happen if you choose each option, and then a values check, like which options align with your values or long term goals. And then also an emotional forecast, like how do you expect to feel during and after each option, and also consider some barriers and support, right? What might help or hinder you in following through? So, why does that help you or clients who procrastinate or have PTSD? Well, procrastinators often avoid decisions due to task aversiveness or overwhelm. So, mapping makes the task concrete and future oriented. And clients with PTSD may be stuck in fear based loops. Decision mapping can help differentiate real versus perceived threat and re engage the PFC. Okay, so let's move on to the second pair, which is perfectionism and financial anxiety. So, perfectionism is not a disorder in the DSM 5, but a core feature of OCPD. So, general perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by striving for flawlessness, setting excessively high performance standards, and being overly critical of oneself and others. Maladaptive or negative perfectionism involves excessive concerns over mistakes, fear of negative evaluation, and chronic dissatisfaction with performance, often linked to anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive tendencies. So, general anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. Let's talk about both of these. Both in the DSM 5. So, general anxiety disorder is excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of events or activities, such as work or school performance. So, basically, the individual finds it difficult to control the worry. Now, there's more to that definition. So, the anxiety and worry are associated with three or more of six symptoms, and those are restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. Social anxiety disorder is a marked fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which the individual is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. For example, social interactions, being observed, or performing in front of others. So, the individual basically fears that they will act in a way or show anxiety symptoms that will be negatively evaluated. So they could be, humiliating or embarrassing, lead to rejection or offend others. And those social situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety and are avoided or endured with intense fear or anxiety. So the fear or anxiety is basically out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation and to the socio-cultural context. Also, in the DSM-5, the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent and typically lasts for 6 months or more. All right. So, what about these? What of these? Well, so here are a variety of different networks involved: the default mode network, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the mPFC that we have already talked about. So I talk about the anterior cingulate cortex first. So basically, this is like your brain's internal performance coach. It monitors how you're doing, how you're feeling, and whether it's worth the effort to keep going. It's responsible for error detection and conflict monitoring, emotional regulation, motivation and effort based decision making, pain perception, especially social pain, attention allocation, so everything basically that has to do with, how you're doing, how you're feeling. uh, and kind of an assessment of effort required. Okay. And the default mode network, that is a group of brain regions. You can see there's several systems involved here that are more active when a person is at rest and not focused on the external environment. So it's on during daydreaming, introspection, or recalling personal memories. So basically, what the default mode network is, and by the way, it has like several components here, right? I'll talk about these briefly. So the medial prefrontal cortex. So you see the dorsal and ventral areas of the medial prefrontal cortex here. Uh, so that is involved in self-referential thinking, as I talked about before, such as reflecting on your own thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Okay. The posterior cingulate cortex, right here, its function, it plays a central role in integrating emotional and autobiographical memory and shifting attention between internal and external states. The precuneus, right, you can see it right here, is important for visual imagery, episodic memory retrieval, and aspects of consciousness. And then the Angular gyrus supports semantic processing, number comprehension, and the integration of sensory information for meaning making. All right. So, what basically the default mode network is a place where we go to ruminate, which is obsessional thinking involving excessive, repetitive thoughts or themes that interfere with other forms of mental activity. It is a common feature of obsessive compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, according to the American Psychological Association. So, this is where we go if we're not actually currently involved in anything, right? So we're not actually, involved in a task. So we go there and then we start wondering in that conversation, was he criticizing me? Was there an undertone to that email that they sent me? We just start worrying. And it's usually when we're not busy with something, where we go is usually not a good place, which is kind of sad, actually. Um, so, how does this play out then? So, if the ACC is your internal performance coach, then in perfectionism, the coach is hyperactive and is constantly pointing out flaws. In anxiety, the coach either overreacts to small errors or freezes under pressure. And together, you're basically stuck in a loop of self monitoring and second guessing, and you're unable to relax or feel accomplished. So, the inner compass, in perfectionism, the compass is rigid and points only towards perfect. In anxiety, however, the compass becomes unreliable and swings wildly in response to fear, which makes it hard to feel safe. So together, you basically lose your internal sense of direction and rely on external validation or fear-based control. The default mode network is like your mental living room, right? So in perfectionism, that living room is cluttered with critical voices and replayed mistakes. It's hard to relax when basically every thought is a performance review. In anxiety, the living room becomes a worry chamber and is filled with what ifs and imagined catastrophes. So, together, instead of being a place of rest, your mental living room becomes a source of stress and self attack. But, as some of you may have already thought, perfectionism isn't a personality quirk. It's basically anxiety dressed in high achievement clothing. So, perfectionism is anxiety just with a polished resume. And so, as a shared mental architecture, basically in perfectionism and anxiety, the coach is too harsh, the compass is too rigid, and the living room is too noisy. So, the brain is always on alert, never satisfied, and deeply self critical. And the coach critiques, the compass spins, and the living room is cluttered. So, how can we help our clients here? Well, the coach basically wants you to succeed, right? But needs to learn when to rest. So, we could use something like acceptance and commitment therapy to reduce fusion with perfectionistic thoughts. The compass, the mPFC, wants to guide you but needs recalibration towards the values. So maybe we want to use compassion focused therapy here to build a kinder internal compass. The living room wants to reflect, but it needs decluttering and compassion. So maybe we could use internal family systems or mindfulness based cognitive therapy here. So all of these are possibilities. Um, okay, so before I go on to the next, the loss aversion and grief area, I wanted to just give an example here of a couple of clients so that illustrate these two. So let's say uh, for the first one, so for procrastination and trauma, let me give you an example of a client that may or may not be hypothetical. Natasha was in her late 20s and kept saying she just couldn't get started on a business she'd been dreaming about for years. She really wanted to do this. Okay. But every time she got close to launching, whether it was working on designing a logo or emailing her list, she'd find herself deep cleaning her kitchen and doom scrolling Instagram. So she basically just couldn't get started. So at first, that looked like classic procrastination. But over time, what we actually found out is there was a deeper layer. In her early 20s, she'd been in an abusive relationship where any step towards independence basically triggered emotional retaliation. So her brain had learned something very important, and that is that visible ambition isn't safe. So basically, her hippocampus was stuck in the past, right? It was reliving the threat. Her amygdala was sounding alarms at every new idea, and her prefrontal cortex couldn't override it. So it wasn't that she didn't care, her nervous system just didn't feel safe enough to act. So that's a good illustration, right? That's why we can't just push clients through resistance. Sometimes what looks like a motivation issue is actually a memory issue, and the brain is doing its job just a little too well. And a giveaway here is when she said that every time I get close to launching, I feel this pit in my stomach, like I'm waiting for something bad to happen. But there's no reason for it. Nothing's even gone wrong. So she is kind of aware of this, right? So what that statement signals, though, is that her body is responding as if a threat is present. So that's her amygdala at work. Even though her current environment is safe, her hippocampus hasn't updated the timeline and it's still referencing the past as if it were now. And her prefrontal cortex is confused by the mismatch, which leads to second guessing and shutdown. Um, so basically, that's a classic sign that the past is louder than the present, right? Her nervous system doesn't trust that she's safe, even when her life now tells a different story. So, another example for perfectionism and anxiety, again, may or may not be a hypothetical client, is Marcus. Marcus is a 35-year-old financial analyst who was always on. Okay. He described himself as a high achiever, but underneath, there was constant tension. So he triple checked everything, every report. He stayed late most nights and beat himself up for even minor feedback. He even once told me that vacations made him more anxious than relaxed, so he couldn't even enjoy that. Without something to accomplish, his thoughts got louder, not quieter. So over time, it became clear that perfectionism was his armor, but anxiety was actually what lived underneath that armor. His internal coach, the ACC, never shut up. Okay? And his medial prefrontal cortex couldn't anchor to internal values, only external approval. So the default mode network wasn't a place for rest. It was basically a pressure cooker for him. And here's what, kind of brought the two together. So what he said is, if I don't get it exactly right, it feels like something bad is going to happen. I don't even know what. I just feel it in my chest. So that shows, well, three things, right? Perfectionism as a coping strategy to keep anxiety at bay. It shows an overactive coach tied to fear rather than growth. And it shows emotional reasoning replacing clarity. So he can't explain the fear, but he feels it viscerally. Okay. So when the drive for perfection is fused with anxiety, clients don't just want to do well, they need to in order to feel safe. And safety, not success, is their nervous system's real goal. Okay, let's move on to the last section. So the last pair we're going to be covering is loss aversion and grief. So, loss aversion is a concept from behavioral economics and psychology. Basically, it just states that people tend to prefer avoiding losses rather than acquiring equivalent gains. So, the pain of losing something is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. It is a cornerstone of prospect theory by Kahneman and Tversky, both unfortunately no longer with us, but giants in this field. So to illustrate this, not monetarily, maybe imagine someone who has been in a romantic relationship for several years. So over time, they realize they're no longer happy or compatible with their partner, but they hesitate to end the relationship. Why? Because they may know that there's something better on the other side. However, if that better is not at least twice as good as what they're giving up, then they're going to be hesitant to do that because, again, the pain of losing something is about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something. So that's a very powerful example of how loss aversion can keep people in situations that no longer serve them because the fear of losing outweighs the hope of gain. So grief is indirectly addressed in the DSM-5. So DSM-5 Section 3 is a persistent complex bereavement disorder, or PCBD, for people who experience intense prolonged grief persisting for at least 12 months, 6 months for children, with significant functional impairment. The DSM-5 text revision replaced PCBD with prolonged grief disorder, which is intense disabling grief that lasts longer than 12 months with symptoms like identity disruption, difficulty moving on, emotional numbness, or intense worry or preoccupation with the deceased. Okay, so I want to focus on two specific areas here. And again, these are not the only areas that are involved in loss aversion and grief, but they provide a nice contrast. So the first is the insula. Okay, so the insula is kind of like hidden, right? You can think of the insula as like the brain's hidden emotional switchboard. It's deeply integrated in the brain as involved in connecting your body, emotions, and awareness. It's small and hidden, but it's really, really powerful and plays a very important role in shaping how you feel, how you interpret, and how you respond to both internal and external experiences. So it's like your brain's, like I said, hidden emotional switchboard or your internal dashboard, right? It collects signals from your body, scans for emotional meaning, and sends real-time updates to guide how you feel and what to do next. So the general functions of the insula are interoception, emotional processing, risk and uncertainty detection, social emotions and empathy, addiction and craving, and pain perception. The ventral striatum, you might know. The nucleus accumbens, you've probably heard of, right? They're key parts of the reward system. So it's in the basal ganglia in the forebrain. So the VTA projects dopamine neurons to the ventral striatum, right? The ventral tegmental area. So the ventral striatum is like your brain's reward radar. So it's constantly scanning for what feels good, what matters, and what to move toward. Okay? So the striatum also includes the caudate nucleus. More specifically, the striatum is composed of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the nucleus accumbens. All right. So what do we do with these areas? Well, so the emotional switchboard, the insula, in loss aversion, basically the switchboard lights up with discomfort at the thought of losing, sounds the alarm before the loss even happens, and makes minor risks feel like major threats. In grief, the switchboard is flooded with the signal of what's already gone, which broadcasts heartache, tightness in the chest, and a hollow ache in the gut. So together, basically, the switchboard distinguishes poorly between what you might lose and what you already lost. So in loss aversion, the reward radar, the ventral striatum, fixates on potential gains, but loss signals shut it down fast. Whereas in grief, the radar keeps pinging for reward that's no longer there and creates emotional craving and yearning. So together, their shared impact is the radar gets confused and either avoids action to prevent loss or clings to what's already gone. So, together, again, the shared mental architecture is that the emotional switchboard is overloaded and rings loud whether the loss is anticipated or real. The reward radar misfires and either shuts down at the threat of loss or fixates on what's gone. And the nervous system responds to both with tension, withdrawal, or craving. So, whether you're afraid to lose or mourning what you've lost, your system basically says this is unsafe, brace, don't move. So, how can we reframe that to help our clients? Well, the emotional switchboard is trying to protect you from emotional pain, whether it's real or imagined. So, we could use somatic grounding here, or interoceptive practices, or mindfulness. So, interoceptive practices is feeling into your body, right? Like where things are, like hunger, etc., and where your emotions are in your body. On the other hand, the reward center is still searching for what mattered, whether it's gone or just as risk. So maybe you can help your clients reconnect with your values and practice gratitude and curiosity, or use behavioral activation. So in behavioral activation, it's a good example. So the first thing you want to do is identify avoidance behaviors, like for example, staying in bed late or avoiding social outings or no longer cooking or walking the dog. And then the next thing you want to do is clarify values and meaning. So maybe they value connection, nurturing others, and being in nature. And then choose small aligned actions, like maybe walk the dog for 5 minutes each morning, or invite a friend for coffee once this week, or prepare one meaningful meal using a favorite recipe of your partner. Okay. And then you want to schedule and track. So basically place those activities on a weekly planner and review them in session. So the client rates the mood before and after each activity to build insight into what their behavioral emotional patterns are. And then you want to adjust and expand. So as the client experiences small emotional lift or moments of meaning, those activities are expanded. So they may join a walking group or volunteer at a community kitchen over time. So basically, behavioral activation helps the brain's reward system re-engage. And rather than waiting for motivation or healing to come first, it uses action to generate energy, connection, and hope, especially when the internal systems are frozen by grief or fear of loss. So that was just one example of something that could be used. So before going into the closing here, I wanted to give you an example of a client uh, that was struggling with loss aversion and grief. So this is Elena, was a 42-year-old who had recently gone through painful divorce. So she came to coaching because she couldn't bring herself to re-enter the dating world or even think about moving apartments, even though the house was full of painful reminders. She was also stuck in another way, though. So she couldn't make basic financial decisions, like even investing a bonus from work or even closing a joint account. So every option felt risky. So she would say things like, "What if I need that later?" Or, "I don't want to make a mistake I'll regret." So at first glance, what does that look like? That looks like loss aversion, right? Hesitation around financial risk. But underneath that loss aversion was grief. So her insula was still signaling pain from what was already lost, and her ventral striatum couldn't detect the reward in the future. It was still pinging for the life that used to be there. And it really kind of crystallized in when she said, "I know he's not coming back, but every time I think about letting go of our old life, it feels like I'm losing him all over again." So, what that quote reveals is that the emotional switchboard is blurring the line between real and anticipated loss. And the reward radar, the ventral striatum, is still oriented towards the past. So, basically, you have a system that equates moving forward with re experiencing grief. So, for her, the fear of future loss wasn't just about money. It was her nervous system clinging to what was familiar, even if it was painful, because to let go felt like betrayal. In those moments, we're not just navigating behavior, but we're also honoring their attachment to what they've lost. So we have one brain, but many behaviors, right? So the symptoms may be different, but across multiple behaviors, the same circuitry is often involved. So the behaviors aren't broken, they're protective. So maybe we can normalize avoidance, shame, or over control as adaptive brain responses rather than something that doesn't work right. Maybe you want to target the system and not just the symptom and look for shared mechanisms. like emotional regulation, time disorientation, and reward confusion. So what we should do is use interventions that retrain those brain circuits. So takeaways from you, hopefully, so your clients aren't irrational, right? Their nervous systems are doing exactly what they were trained to do. So instead of asking what's wrong with this behavior, ask what system is overprotecting right now. So again, we want to treat the pattern, not just the presentation. And that shared neurocircuitry often means shared solutions and invites us to explore those shared solutions. So I hope you find this helpful in thinking of what is going on in the brain with different behaviors as something that can be investigated further and maybe thought of differently when you talk to your clients. Thank you very much for watching.